1st of November in 2025. And what I have been struggling with in this context, the context of this playlist, is that I would like to move further into Robert Avens' The New Gnosis, with chapter 2, which is called From Phenomenology to Angelology. And section 1 is called Phenomena, Images, and Angels. And this kind of language makes me quite uncomfortable coming from a secular and scientific background. And so what I've realized is I want to connect this up a little bit to the broader work that I think is relevant and important in the world today, and also to some contexts of understanding that have informed me. And that will, I think, allow me to situate or recontextualize that chapter and indeed the rest of Avens' work. And that is episodes 48 and 9 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. One of the questions one might have is, what am I doing here? And a long time ago, I was sort of struck by this existential awareness of, you could call some kind of, hey, all is not well in the world in uh, in the sense of, I think Daniel Schmachtenberger said at one point, like, if we don't like find a way to sort of increase our collective intelligence at a kind of faster rate than our technological innovating, that the power of that technology will mean that there will be a big collapse, and there might not be humans anymore. And I guess, yeah, I'm someone who had an existential sense for that possibility and felt motivated by it long before it was confirmed by many people, Schmachtenberger among them. And so there's a sense for a kind of cultural acceleration, or it's the thing is, it's not the word Renaissance means rebirth in a sense. I think it was E.O. Wilson said the fundamental problem is that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, which is not very fair to our emotions. But the basic idea is, and again, this ties us over to Vervaeke, what is the proper cultural response to the situation that we find ourselves in, which is not simply the awareness of the metacrisis, but actually the awareness of the fall, the human condition. What's the proper response to this? Is it possible to come to a kind of secular road that can give us access to the sense of sacredness and existential awareness that is our birthright, without without needing to believe in anything supernatural? As someone with some scientific training, I found that attractive and interesting and reasonable, not least in the wake of this inheritance through Nietzsche and Jung of the death of God in modern secular culture. And so then we have this prescription for an that this cultural enlightenment might be facilitated by an ecology of practices in a community of practitioners with a kind of viable worldview and a pedagogical program that really works as part of a decentralized network of emerging communities that could give rise to an ongoing, evolving, unfolding form of collective intelligence. lately I've been exploring that in terms of anthropology, right? Trying to get a little bit more familiar with, okay, we can run a kind of Greek model and do a, you know, Pythagorean mystery school or Platonic academy, these kinds of models. But if we look back even deeper, what is it that makes us really human? And can we frame this cultural response as something that gets back to the core of our humanity? And I think we can. And what that's led me to is to start getting specific, again, following John, that this ecology of practices, this prescription that I've mentioned, is designed to explicitly intended to reverse engineer enlightenment. And that what enlightenment is as a functional, let's say, concept is actually this kind of developmental flywheel of this ecology of practices, not a state. And that we're actually in a position to have a pretty good sense for what kinds of practices may help us in terms of deepening our awareness of being here. And the basic idea is something like that. Hey, we actually have the willpower and we have the technology. We have everything that we could want, right? It's just that we're numb. It's just that we don't feel who we are. And so there are different ways of breaking it down that human culture has to do with this thing of taking any polarity, any pair of opposites, and basically dissolving it, reconstituting boundaries between categories, reconstituting the stories that we tell and the identities that we inhabit. That's from the Human Origins playlist. We also see that these practices could facilitate this for us. And I will explore more of it at a different point in time, but this is kind of what I've meant by this is that we've been stuck in a particular story at the level of duality. One becomes two. And the whole point of this, John's prescription of access, practical access to perspectival and participatory knowing, to those deeper layers of our being, is that we can get out of different stories, different identities, and reconstitute them by developing our facility with perspective seeking, perspective taking, and access to gnosis. That's one way of understanding this. It really does mean from two becomes three, and from the third comes the one as the fourth in any two and any three and any four. But understanding three as taking perspectives and four as gnosis is a fair way to approach that. And so, well, what kinds of practices? Well, dialogical practices, imaginal practices, mindfulness practices, and embodiment practice. And the idea would be that these kinds of practices can help us get familiar with hmm, different different components of our cognitive architecture, the substructures of who we are. Such as perspectival and participatory awareness is one thing. But another way to frame that would be that such practices, again, dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied, they involve, this is from Peterson Maps of Meaning, they involve creative behavior, imitation, serious play, ritual, drama, and myth, as well as explicit philosophy, not to mention literature on the way through. And so, yeah, ritual, drama, serious play, these are all deeply connected. So what I'd like to connect there is that in terms of Robert Avens, the new gnosis, what I'm really trying to understand is the relevance of gnosis itself and what it means, but then how to approach these concepts, this term angel, in a way that draws on what Vervaeke is talking about. And so if we can roughly see this, I mean, this is not my prescription, right? Although I'm certainly also endorsing it because I think it's true. I think it's pretty likely that some combination of all these kinds of practices can deepen our sense of being in the world. And I think that's the likeliest route through the crisis point that we are beset with situationally, that we're inevitably participating in and navigating through. And why? Why is that? What is it about the transformations that could result from this ecology of practices that could be helpful? How can we understand the transformations of self and world that arise through such practice in terms of gnosis and in terms of a term like angel? And how does that help us? Well, is there anything else before I begin? One other thing, all of that constellation of forms of practice, right, as a way to facilitate kind of cultural enlightenment of some kind, has been for me clearly connected through this series with the notion of re-ensoulment and recovering and deepening our sense of, yeah, 4E re-ensoulment, the embedded, embodied, enacted, and extended nature of who we are, such that we can be in this reciprocal opening process with the world and not only come to an awareness of our own souls, but also the soul of the world. So to me, there's no difference between the prescription that I was talking about and the practice of re-ensoulment. They're the same. Why is it relevant? Well, the practice of re-ensoulment also involves taking the many dead objects which we see, the things which we have, and animating them, drawing them up into the life of who we are, into animation, so that we don't treat them so much as objects, but instead relate with being or relate while being with a little more sensitivity. So that's about objects. But it also has to do with this practice of re-ensoulment. It also has to do with taking ideas or what have in the past been conceived as gods or virtues, or powers and principalities, if you like, I think, and drawing them down to earth to be here in an ensouled way. Again, Rilke, everything here seems to need us. And what's left out of that little scheme is the people. Again, there are these three dimensions, let's say, of the world and three different spheres of kind of activity of the re-ensoulment of the world, being our facility with the many things of the world, going down to the multiplicity, Maya illusion, the mother, the earth, the many objective sensory things. And also going up to the abstract, to the spiritual, to the ungrounded, to the transcendent. But that all could be conceived quite, it's all depersonalized in a certain way. And so, especially in the context of dialogos practice, as a kind of meta-psychotechnology that is designed to update and regulate the function of this ecology of practices, there are intrapsychic and interpersonal dimensions of this practice. Namely, the interpersonal layer involves an awareness of and facility with our inner community, the community of, for example, the parts that we have, as a way to approach this. All the stuff about the dialogical self, the different aspects of who we are, but also the people of this world, people of this earth, relating with them. And then I would not only say that, but also that angels in some way actually fit into this category. It's the personified face of things, of ideas, of virtues, and of people. And to me, I have this understanding that the term angel or the term daemon, for example, divine double, like that, all of those sorts of terms, they're connected with this relational interpersonal layer of being. And that the practice of re-ensoulment has to be able to work with that. Not in passing that our self-memory, like the identity that we take is is a kind of memory that derives from the participatory level of our being. It's this self in that context as an identity that we take up as an emergent property of this transjective opponent processing between self and world. It's one thing. So we start talking about transformative knowing, right? Transformative experience, the kind of gnosis that can change our sense of who we are, change our sense of identity, as well as our awareness of the world that we inhabit. But notice also that this stuff about, quote, angelology definitely has to do with being able to recognize and dialogue with different parts, different perspectives, different beings, different daemons. And how to do that. That was sort of participatory and then perspectival, and then that all of that could definitely change our sense of the story that we're inhabiting, the narrative that we tell ourselves about who we are, on top of our more existential awareness of who we are, the narrative layer of our identity. So that's all sort of by way of preamble. I don't know if that was really coherent in the end. I think it was coherent. I was talking about, well, like, why are we here? And for me, it's how do we respond to the metacrisis properly by doing this cultural enlightenment piece. And how does that go along with re-ensoulment? Well, we have these four layers of practice: DIME, dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied practice, as connected with sort of serious play, ritual, drama, imitation, and creative behavior, as well as philosophy. So that's all pretty connected. And this is the kind of practices and understanding that we need for this cultural enlightenment. And then the practice of re-ensoulment really goes along with that, or is concomitant with that, involving this facility with these three different dimensions of being: ideas, people, and things, or spirit, soul, and body. Really going along with this along the way in terms of the four layers of knowing. And so what we're wanting to do is approach a little bit more facility with that interpersonal, that middle layer, because I've talked mostly about the upper and lower layers. I've been reading a lot about IFS therapy and a lot of Hillman at the moment. And I want to approach this chapter 2 in the new gnosis. And to get there, I feel the need to really explicitly presence Vervaeke's work because it's being heavily relied on and with good reason. When I listened to episodes 48 and 9 of Waking from the Meaning Crisis, which are published some time ago now, I think in 2018, it took me many listenings to really wrap my head around the implications of all of that work in the context of the stuff that I was just laying out. Well, for me, the implications for me, let's say. And I also think of it as really prerequisite for trying to understand this Robert Avens stuff about Hillman and Heidegger and Corbin. And so what I've chosen to do, I've updated my methodology a little bit. I'm slowly getting better at this. It's going to take a long time before it gets to something that I would really consider adequate anyway. What I'm going to do is I'm going to presence John's words, by which I mean I'm going to read what he said. And he already said this stuff, so go listen to him say it. But when I say it, it puts it explicitly in the context of this series, which is helpful for me. And it gives me a chance to integrate the insights that come from those episodes into the content that I'm trying to draw together in this series by commenting on what he's saying. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just like make sure that people are aware that this is John's work, what I'm going to be reading. It's not my work. And I'm drawing from John's work to later understand more of what Avens is talking about. Indeed, I got the recommendation for Avens' book from episode 48. And I'm going to be reading out different parts of what John said and commenting on it. And I think of that as necessary preparation for what's to follow. Pull up the screen. And yeah, this is exhaustive, but that's okay. I think it doesn't hurt anyone, I think, to listen more to what John has to say. And certainly in this context, it might yield me different insights than it already has. So, welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Wow, never thought I'd hear me say that. I've been listening to John for years, and he's a major influence on my thought, and so all due credit. I'm going to try and I'm literally going to read out because It's just like I like to be thorough and complete, so that's what I'm going to try and do. And it helps me to stay grounded in the text that I'm referring to. And I'm going to try and indicate when I want to say something that is mine rather than someone else's. And I don't know how I'm going to do that. I'll do my best to indicate it. Okay. Quote, so last time we were pursuing in depth trying to understand Heidegger's work as a prophet in the Old Testament sense of the meaning crisis. We took a look at this notion of the thing beyond itself and realness as simultaneously the shining into our framing and the withdrawing beyond our framing in a deeply inter-affording, interpenetrating manner. We took a look at this deeper notion of truth not as correctness, but truth as aletheia, that which grounds the agent-arena relationship in attunement and allows us the potential to remember being by getting into an attunement with its simultaneous disclosure and withdrawal. But we can forget that. We can get into a kind of modal confusion. And this is the history of metaphysics as the emergence of nihilism. This is the history of metaphysics as the emergence of nihilism. That we can forget the being mode. We can get trapped into the having mode, which in metaphysics is a propositional project of trying to just use truth as correctness. And so we misunderstand being as a particular being. We try to capture the unlimited aspect of being. We try to capture the unlimitedness aspect of being. But we only do it at the limit, which Heidegger is deeply critical of. And so we understand being in terms of a supreme being, a being at the limit and beyond the limit. And this is ontotheology. We understand God as the supreme being. We understand God as the supreme being. And this is deeply enmeshed for Heidegger with nihilism. Because this ontotheology, this theological way, at least a version of theology from sort of the classical traditional theism, this way of understanding being gets us into the deep forgetfulness and modal confusion that is the hallmark of nihilism. But of course, we could perhaps remember the being mode. And this is what Henry Corbin, following Heidegger, talks about as gnosis. We can understand what this gnosis is. What does it look like? What would it be like to remember from the being mode through aletheia being? What would it be like to remember being? So I, John, want to pick up on this idea of gnosis serious play in a particular piece of work by Heidegger. Heidegger discusses, and this Avens discusses this in his book, the one that we're looking at. And Caputo also discusses this in his excellent book. It's Heidegger's commentary on the poetry of Angelus Silesius. Angelus Silesius was a poet who was basically trying to put into poetry, and we can foresee some of the things Barfield is going to say. Silesius is trying to put into poetry the work of Meister Eckhart, who was one of the great Neoplatonic mystics within the Rhineland mystics that John talked about so long ago. Now, what's important, of course, for Meister Eckhart and this discussion of gnosis, as the remembering through aletheia of the being mode that alleviates the forgetfulness, alleviates nihilism, is that Eckhart, of course, is also experiencing this as a form of sacredness, as something that's appropriate to a religious context. So he also noted in conjunction with that Paul Tillich is going to be deeply influenced by Heidegger's critique of ontotheology. But he's also going to situate it within, although he's going to radically revise what this means, he's going to situate it within a traditional religious term, which is idolatry. Now let's think about Heidegger's commentary on this poem. So what's the poem? So here's the poem in translation. We lose some of the poetry that way. Quote, "The rose is without why. It blooms because it blooms. It cares not for itself, asks not if it is seen. The rose is without why. It blooms because it blooms. It cares not for itself, asks not if it is seen." So it's interesting that when Heidegger is doing this, he's actually talking about this word physis. Physis, the Greek word, which of course is the core of the word physics, which again, Heidegger is trying to get back to a re-experiencing of the physical as an important way of remembering the being mode. And this is why I, John, think many people understand. And I've argued this elsewhere, I'm going to keep coming back to it. The response to the meaning crisis is somehow a rejection of physicalism and the physical. But Heidegger, instead, Heidegger is trying to show how the physical can be more deeply remembered. Now he's picking up on the Greek for this term, indicates physis. So again, Heidegger is doing some etymological work here. So physis means blossoming forth from itself, springing forth from itself. Very much like the rose being described. Think about what this means. This is what Heidegger says. The blossoming of the rose is grounded in itself, has its ground in itself. The blossoming is a pure emerging out of itself, pure shining. Now, what's going on now? Of course, Heidegger will never talk just about the shining, even though he doesn't explicitly mention it here. It's implied, and we should therefore remember it in the phrase emerging out of itself, that the shining is simultaneously withdrawing. We get a sense of the depth of the rose in its physis, because as it shines in a way that's showing that it's shining out of itself, shining out of its depth, shining out of that into which it withdraws, shining out of that into which it withdraws, as it presents itself to our phenomenological experience. Okay, sorry about that. First, couple of things here. One of them, just to mention what happened, I was recording and a cloud of mayflies suddenly burst upon the scene, and I had to move because I didn't want to deal with a cloud of mayflies being present during my recording. Now, anything else? Yes, one is invited to look up the transcripts and follow along there because I feel like not screen sharing it anymore, although I'm going to look at it, keep going. And while we're here, I want to mention in passing that we're talking about this rose, we're talking about its shining out of its depth, shining out of that which it withdraws. Sorry, shining out of that into which it withdraws as it presents itself to our phenomenological experience. And I think it would be fair to connect this over to what in Avens, drawing from Hillman, is talking about as the image of something, which is like the way that something appears, like the way that we see anything. Like if you look at anything that's here, we only see it as an image of itself. And the same with people, right? We see people as a kind of instantiation, uh, a self-presentation of who someone is. I think that's what it would like in this way, like this recovering an aletheic sense of inhabiting an imaginal world is kind of equivalent to recognizing that the aspects, the faces that present themselves to us are images, are symbols that convey these existential depths of what things are to our phenomenological awareness, that things shine forth out of their own depth. Okay. Yep, now I get to keep going. So where were we? So now back to John. Again, we get a sense of the depth of the rose in its physis because as it shines in a way that's showing that it's shining out of itself, shining out of its depth, shining out of that into which it withdraws as it presents itself to our phenomenological experience. So here, he's picking up on one of Eckhart's maxims. This is what Eckhart said, live without why. We could also translate it, live without a why. And now that sounds to some people like, what? It sounds like a meaningless existence. There's no why, there's no purpose. There's no grand unifying purpose. Think about it a little bit more carefully, right? Is that quest for the grand culminating purpose, is that maybe perhaps coming from the having mode and not from the being mode? Eckhart is not proposing meaninglessness. He's actually proposing a non-teleological way of being. A non-teleological way of being. It's to move beyond. There's no narrative to the rose. It's not that it's sort of lacking. It's beyond, above and beyond, or beneath the narrative. So a way of thinking about this, and I, John, promised to come back to this earlier in the series, and I've come back to it now. And we talked about this in a couple of places. We talked about it with the Stoics. We talked about it when perhaps we can't get back to a narrative in the sense of a teleological aspect to physis, to the physical world. But maybe the universe as a whole is like the rose. Maybe it's blooming from itself, grounded in itself, blossoming, shining from itself, while always withdrawing. And think about how well that actually comports with, the physics of an ever-expanding universe coming out of the Big Bang, but grounded in the quantum. Like, is that so far and away of talking about the universe? That's very much like the rose. And we get better at being connected to its physis if we drop the axial age requirement that there be a teleological narrative to it all. Okay, pausing. Just going to notice in passing that narrative identity is, of course, an important component of our identity. But John is pointing to these other deeper layers of who we are, and that if we get stuck in certain stories about who we are, that we can come to only relate to the world in a certain way. Like there's a way, for example, if I use Peterson's thing of like whether there's a point A and a point B and a way to get from point A to point B, and that's what a story is. So the idea would be that if we are a certain character, if I'm a certain, if I have a certain narrative identity, that this is my character, that it locks us into a particular story, right? It's a particular framing of this is who I am, this is where I'm trying to get to, and this is how I'm going to do that. So the idea is that by recovering, or in fact uncovering, unveiling our access to these deeper layers of who we are, that we can gain this flexibility with personification, that we can gain this flexibility with character, flexibility with narrative identity. But at the same time, not simply just jump rapidly between one identity to the next, right, in a schizophrenic way, but participate more deeply in being, which is also the same as participating more deeply in ourselves, who we are. There are clear links there to serious play, to drama, to ritual, to imaginal enactment, to assuming a certain identity, right? Taking on a mask, taking on a certain role, and participating deeply in that role in an imaginal way, so as to experience the world differently by, again, modifying our comportment, approaching the world in a different way, and seeing how it appears to us differently. Just pausing a second. I briefly also wanted to reconnect this again with one becomes two. And essentially, what this prescription is saying in my language is two becomes three. And then what we're talking about in terms of reverse engineering enlightenment is from the third comes the one as the fourth, which is from out of our different perspectives, namely the perspectives of the soul. If we can all inhabit the perspective of our soul, then from out of that, deeper sense and emergence, emanation, co-transformation of transjective co-transformation of self and world can arise that is functionally equivalent to enlightenment as far as the relevance of that term goes. That's why the alchemical Gnostic prophecy, well, that's how it fits in, one way that it fits in. And very briefly, that is the back cover of my copy of Zombies in Western Culture. And yeah, we were talking about procedural knowing, right? This knowing that is of techne, this forgetting, Heidegger's forgetting of being, where our existential awareness, the aletheic unveiling of the truth of Dasein, the truth of being here, and our care for being is forgotten in the having mode because what we do is have things rather than be in the world. And that knowing how that excessive power in the world through our techne, through our technology, right? Our objectifying of being in a left hemispheric sense, this gives us an excess of purpose, an excess of narrative order. And it's not that those things are a problem, but that there's a call for narrative identity and narrative order in the world to be rebalanced with reference to deeper presence and deeper attunement or gnosis. And so the idea is not to reject any one particular story, but to point to the common ground of all stories and of all identities that inhabit those stories, and indeed of all purposive or teleological through lines. Okay, where was I? I'm just checking this is still going, and yes, it is still going. Okay, back to John. So, narrative and non-logical identity. Actually, it does start giving visuals, so I am gonna briefly bring back the share. I apologize for that. Is that visible? Yes, it should be. Okay. Just I need to check this is still going. It is. Keep messing it up technology-wise. Okay. Narrative and non-logical identity. This horizontal narrative, look, it's important. The horizontal narrative gives us practice, practice in something, gives us important practice in something. We're going to come back to this thing because the thing about narrative is, yeah, narrative gives you deep practice, cognitive existential practice in, quote, non-logical identity. We've talked about this in the relationship it has to the symbol. So let's talk about it. First of all, in the symbol, Remember, here's a framing. Here's figure two. And then you transframe. It's framing and transframing. And there's a non-logical identity between the world inside the frame and the world outside the frame. And it's a non-logical identity, which is between, right? Between you here and you there. Remember this? This is a non-logical identity between who you are inside this frame and who you are after, right? A transframing. Remember that when we talked about aspiration, we talked about aspiration. I'm going to pause there for a second, and that was all John, and it's now me, Sam, again. And we can see here that there's a connection between inside, outside, as in subject and objective, as in what we call the internal or intrapsychic world, and the external, or the world outside, the world out there. So that's kind of that's a sort of Jungian subject and object, if you like. But this non-logical identity is also between you here and you there, right? So that, look, there's a teleological, so it's not necessarily teleological, but there's a narrative through line in not just space, but time. There's me now and me then. And this is the Petersonian sense of like point A, me here, here now, in this situation here. And then that situation there where we're trying to get to, the intention or the goal, the aim, in the sense of wish upon a star or, the flag upon the hill, these kind of the myths of getting to somewhere and getting to be someone as connected with aspirational development, proleptic rationality, becoming someone. And this, what he's saying, again, so this is between, I need to draw that together a little bit. So the subject and object, and subject and object is clearly there's a sense of horizontality to that. But what I'm connecting here is that me now and me then. Um, One way to understand that is in chronological time, as in me then in the future. But I think a different way to understand this is me as incarnated in chronological time and me in eternity, the eternal I. And that's more vertical, right? So we're talking about narrative identity through time, yes, but also the idea of remembering, as in amnesis, is a stepping outside of time, as in kairos, not chronos. And this non-logical identity is between. So whatever this, we're talking about it in terms of symbols, whatever this non-logical identity is, it's between the subject and object, between me now in the present and me then in the future, and also between me now in time and me now out of time. And the idea is that that non-logical identity is an essential component of the rational process of aspiration. Okay, now I'm going to continue quoting from John, which I'm hoping one can still see. Quote, now the thing about narrative is that narrative is a way of representing through time symbolically. Sometimes we're just talking about a kind of transformation through time. But one of the things that narrative does is through time, it represents how you have a non-logical identity to yourself. Yeah, this is John's example. Look, I was born in Hamilton in 1961. I'm not in Hamilton now. I'm not, 9 pounds. I'm 190 pounds. That kid was born in Hamilton, can't speak English, couldn't walk, couldn't move around, certainly couldn't teach this. That kid is in so many ways different, non-identical from me. But in another sense, it's me. And I'm him, right? I mean, it's so ironic because it's me saying it, and I'm him, right? So continuing. Narrative is a way of tracing out and training us in being able to work with non-logical identity. Again, narrative is a way of tracing out and training us in being able to work with non-logical identity, to work with this kind of fundamental transformation. But what we can do, what I think Eckhart is pointing to, we can exact that ability. We can exact that ability for non-logical identity. We can exact that symbolic identity. And instead of thinking of it as unfolding narratively across time, remember the Stoics criticized this. Stop pursuing fame and glory and wealth and power. Instead of the horizontal narrative, we can do the vertical ontology. We can do the vertical ontology in which we're connecting the depths of ourselves to the depths of being in a non-teleological being mode. This is, I think, what Heidegger is pointing to and what Eckhart is pointing to. Interlude, again, for me to say that, yes, we're talking about stepping outside of time. We're talking about kairos, being deeply present here in a sort of perspectival and participatory depths of being and connecting the depths of our own being to the depths of being itself. Yes, wonderful. Ultimately, if we're going to escape dualism, then we would have to escape the dualism of Chronos and Kairos as well. And I think the whole point of someone like Christ, for example, is that is that he was thrown to be himself in the sense of like, we're here, I'm here now, and my chronological incarnation is ultimately not distinct from um, like Kairos and Chronos ultimately can't be separated. So maybe I could offer a reframing of that, that there's been an overemphasis on Chronos, narrative identity, teleology, or sort of the functionality of our narrative identity has been what would I say, imbalanced or directed toward a certain direction, namely toward uh, teleology, toward Chronos, toward having, rather than like, and it's particularly it's having having something, or indeed being someone that we can't ultimately become, or that we don't ultimately have, that we can't ultimately reach. And when it's always at some point in the future, then it always escapes our grasp. But if it's something that in fact we already are, and we can accentuate that, re-realize that religion is the real self-realization of reality, then we can maybe recover, you know, shunyata rather than nihilism. But I think like I don't know if we want to get, I don't know if we can really get out of chronology or like, yeah, the having somewhere to be in time is kind of also important. Anyway, I'm going to keep going. Otherwise, I'm never going to get through this. So pure shining and pure withdrawal. Again, back to John. So as I mentioned, the pure shining, let's put this here. Here's the pure shining, right? The way the rose shines, phenomenon, experience, right? I think that's shining. I think we can talk about this as relevance realization. The salience landscaping into intelligibility. Salience landscaping into intelligibility. Just pausing again to notice that if that's true, right? If the rose is presencing itself, if it's sh shining forth in its presencing uh, into, if it's shining forth as relevance realization, like it's relevance is realizing itself in the pure present shining forth of the rose through its salience landscaping, right? Then if it's into intelligibility, salience landscaping into intelligibility, then John these days is thinking about intelligibility as a fourth transcendental. As far as I'm like, this man is incredibly intelligent and I can't possibly keep up with everything, but yeah, good, true, beautiful, and intelligible. And if that's the case, this to me again maps directly over to from the third comes the one as the fourth, as in not a trinity structure, but four, that there is a fourth. The condition being if it is truly intelligible, then that is a kind of fourth condition. A little vague, so I won't spend too long on it. I'm going to keep going into John. Quote, what about the pure withdrawal? This is the independent inexhaustibleness of a combinatorially explosive reality, right? Independent because it's inexhaustible. We cannot drink it dry. The Tao Te Ching, right? The Tao as a way of understanding physis, the way Heidegger's talking about. There's a book, Heidegger and Asian Thought, or Heidegger's Hidden Sources, where it talks about the connection to Taoism, how he might have been directly influenced. And the Tao Te Ching talks about, the Tao is a well that is never used up. It's inexhaustible mother. The inexhaustible mother. So the independent inexhaustibleness of a combinatorially explosive reality. The things, COE is combinatorially explosive reality. So the things, the thing, and the things beyond themselves. Sorry, I'm hoping that can be seen on screen. It will be, again, quite ironic if I've messed it up again. One could be looking at the transcript. Okay, continuing. I think we can draw these two together. Draws a line between salience landscaping and independent inexhaustibleness. As I've already argued into this, I want to say this very carefully. Quote, we can see this, we can experience this from within the being mode in the following way, a trajectory of transframing that is always closing upon the relevance while always opening to the moreness. It's a trajectory of transframing that's always closing upon the relevance as it's simultaneously always opening to the moreness. When we recognize that aletheia, remember it from within the being mode so that we can accentuate it and celebrate it. That's what I've argued sacredness is. That's what I've argued that sacredness is. And that seems to line up very well with what Eckhart is saying. And one of the things I have about Heidegger is he's reticent to talk about this in terms of sacredness. Tillich isn't, but Heidegger is, and that's part of why I think he goes astray in certain ways. Pausing. So I just want to kind of try and say that in my way. It seems that this again, we have this sort of perspectival and then participatory levels as connected with 3 and 4, but we also have that the third level is connected with noesis or presence, which in this context is sort of the shining forth into intelligibility. But it's also withdrawing, and it's withdrawing into an inexhaustible moreness, which is the 4, right? Which is the mother, the void, the source of all things. We clearly see this relationship between 3 and 4 as present in the shining forth and we're drawing back into, which is um, it's a shining forth into its transcendent suchness in the sense, well, I shouldn't use the word transcendence because it's not the right word to use. Yes, and the idea being, I'm just wrapping my brain around the fact that, or the notion that the suchness and the moreness are in relationship with each other, and the presence and the inexhaustibleness are in relationship with each other, and that the trajectory of transframing that closes upon what's relevant while being open to the moreness, that is and when we recognize that and practice it within the being mode, that's what sacredness is. And that would line up pretty well with from the third comes the one in the fourth, in the sense that reverse engineering enlightenment is the revelation of sacredness as well as the revelation of awareness. Religion as the real self-realization of reality, which is a kind of inherent sacredness. Okay, that was just sort of me putting that together in my way. Now, I'm going to continue. Quote. So we can think of realness as a tonus, this creative tension. It's something that Barfield brings out tremendously and clearly in his work. We can think of realness as a tonus, as a creative polar tension. Look at the word confirmation, coherence, and moreness. Remember, you need both. If if virtual reality just has confirmation and coherence, it falls flat. If it can't provoke a sense of opening and wonder, if there's no element of surprise, if it's all assimilation and no accommodation, if it's all assimilation and no accommodation, remember, accommodation is experienced as all in wonder. And if it's all of that, if it's just assimilation and not accommodation, if it's just foreclosure and never also opening, if it's just the homing and never the numinous, see these themes, then it's not real. It's not experienced as real. And that being able to attune, and this is where the Tao was like, Taoism is such a powerful symbolism, right? You have the yin, which is the confirming, drawing down, and the yang is the opening up. And both of those interpenetrate. Think of the classic Tao symbol within the white as the black dot and the black as the white dot. And they're sinuous because they're interpenetrating, interleaved together. And all of that is the disclosure of the inexhaustibleness of the Tao. I'm trying to make a convergence argument here. Taoism is all about serious play, the serious play with the serious play of being. And that's how Corbin describes it. What he's talking about, when he's talking about gnosis, he talks about the play of being. So does Avens when he's talking about Corbin. So now I'd like to pass now, explicitly leaving Heidegger behind now and moving into Corbin. Pausing just to notice that, I mean, the tie-in for me here, I mean, because that did integrate a lot of different material, right? And now understanding this in a different way. And yeah, for me, what for me, this has implied is that creative tonos is between any two. And the thing about these dualities that we're looking at is that they're so abstract that they can be very inaccessible. And I think if I understand it again in a more abstract way, is that it can be any two, then it helps me to approach things in terms of tonos, right? There were varieties of that all through the episodes on John's essay, dialectic into dialogos, as an essay rather than a practice. Okay, I will keep going because I talked so much about Corbin and the Imaginal and angels that it would suck not to get to it now. Even it's like been a lot about Heidegger, right? So it's just a lot of material. So okay, let's keep going into John, Persian Sufism, and Corbin. Quote, I've already noticed how deeply Corbin was influenced by Heidegger, but he's also deeply influenced by Platonism, and that leads him into probably his deepest influences. So all of these things are important to Corbin. Heidegger, the Neoplatonic tradition, but most especially Neoplatonism with Persian Sufism. So Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam, and Corbin's particularly focused on Persian Sufism. I think that's something important that we should just pause to note. One of the gifts of Corbin's work is to help us remember and thereby overcome our ethnocentrism. How central, and I use that term decidedly, how central Persian philosophy is to the history of philosophy in the world. Persia plays a pivotal role, and I don't mean it as a neglected middle. Well, it is by us, but it shouldn't be a neglected middle. Persia plays a central role between, for example, between the Arab world, the European world, and the world of India and China, the Asiatic world. And what's really important about Persian Sufism, and the history of Persia is a fraught one, we sort of think of now, and this is because, the history, and since the 70s, we think of, Iran is sort of rabidly Muslim and something like that. And that's played up by propaganda. And it's not to deny that there is an Islamic fundamentalist totalitarian regime in control in Iran. But what John is trying to do, is challenge that as a monolithic representation of all of Persia and all of Persian culture. Instead, you have to remember that Persia was made Muslim via an Arab invasion that was nothing less than a genocide. And I know Persians, they remember this deeply to this day. So the attitude towards the Arab overlords is something that has become deeply woven into Persian culture. Why am I saying that? Because that means that the Persians were especially attracted to, at least for huge periods, Rumi and others. They're deeply attracted to Sufism. They're attracted to a mystical interpretation of Islam precisely because they're trying to find a form of liberation from an oppressive Arab empire. So that means that it's important that it is Persian Sufism, and this deeply has an impact on Corbin. He's really taken up by this, and how that Persian Sufism has a much more flexible relationship to Islam than you might think of when you think of Iran in the world today. And so, like, reading the poetry of ancient Persia, well, not even ancient Persia, the poetry from Persia since the Arab invasion and genocide, I think is an important thing to do too. We remember these aspects. Now, Corbin did all of that. He read this stuff deeply, profoundly, repeatedly, extensively. Now, there's ways in which he suffers. There is ways in which, as a Frenchman, he will fundamentally misunderstand some of this literature. And I'm not going to say that he's a perfect interpreter, but I will say that he's an insightful and important interpreter. So he draws all this in. He's drawing in the Heidegger and the Neoplatonism, and this was something that you have to, and the deep influence of Neoplatonism on Sufism. So there's Neoplatonism, then there is a mystical form of Islam, deeply influenced by Neoplatonism, and then Corbin is bringing that into understanding Heidegger. And then he's bringing all of that as a way of trying to explain this gnosis and how this gnosis can ultimately be salvic and redemptive in the face of the meaning crisis. Remember, he talked about gnosis as transformative, salvic, participatory knowing, deep attunement, at one-ment. See how these things are all resonating with each other. Now, what does Corbin bring to this that we don't have in Heidegger? And here's where I think you can see the influence of Sufism and the rich world of Persian poetry upon him. And I think this is an important thing. Corbin sees there and argues for it. Reading Corbin's very different than reading. It's like Heidegger in the sense that it's difficult, but because he's trying to break out of the cognitive and cultural grammar, but it's very lyrical, it's very beautiful. But sometimes you pick up the beauty, and that's again the influence of the Persian poetry on him. You pick up the beauty without, and then you have to pause and say, yeah, but did I really understand what he just said? So you have to read. You almost have to recite Corbin and repeat Corbin. Now he uses that kind of argumentation to make a claim that the recovery of gnosis is bound up with imagination in an important way. And you might think, oh no, John is just going to jump off into some decadent form of romanticism. No, Corbin is going to do something very interesting about this. I recommended Lachman's book that I've recommended for Corbin. See also Avens' book, The New Gnosis. See all of Chetham's works, The World Turned Inside Out, Imaginal Love. The third one, I think it was The Angelic Nature of Being. I can't remember the third title. Anyways, we'll put up all the panels. Chetham's work on Corbin. In fact, I recommend reading Avens and Chetham before you read Corbin So if you take a look, Corbin is doing something very important with this. He's not using this word, indicates imagination, the way we typically use it. In order to bring that out, he makes a distinction. And that distinction is going to be important when we talk about Jung. Okay, going the distinction between imaginary and imaginal. He makes a distinction between the imaginary and what he calls the imaginal, and it's the imaginal that's bound up with gnosis. The imaginal is bound up with gnosis. So imaginary. Imaginary is what we typically mean when we invoke the word imagination. We mean the purely subjective experience of generating inner mental imagery, which we know is not real, and that it's sort of completely in our control and we can play with it as we wish. That is explicitly, clearly, and definitively not what Corbin is talking about. Corbin is talking about the imaginal. And to try to convey the imaginal, I'm going to try and schematically represent it to you. Because if you don't get the imaginal, you don't get what Corbin is talking about. I also would say ultimately you do not get what Jung is talking about when he's talking about active imagination, because you'll just misunderstand active imagination as purely imaginary experience as opposed to imaginal experience. And as I'll point out later, Corbin and Jung are deeply influential of each other. Corbin is much more open about that relationship. Corbin talks about it and invokes Jung, often critically, but at least clearly and explicitly and with credit. And way more often than I see Jung talking about Corbin, which is, I think, a criticism I have of Jung. Okay, so let's try to represent this. So first of all, think of two ways in which you sort of try and represent or come into contact with reality. One is through abstract representations, the abstract intelligible world, the world that you get through your intellect, right? So, you grasp reality as a mathematical formula or something like that. You know that you grasp reality as a purely formal entity. And then in contrast, there is, of course, the concrete. And of course, concrete and abstract are always relative terms. They're not absolute terms. The concrete, sensible world, the bottom. So we have these two, abstract intelligible world and concrete sensible world. So one thing the imaginal does is it actually mediates between these two. It bridges between them. It allows them to come together in meaningfully structured experience. It allows them to come together in meaningfully structured experience. Because in my phenomenological experience, of course, there's both an intelligible order that I can abstract intellectually, but that intelligible order also affects the way I come into sensual contract concretely with it. So the imaginal mediates between these. And one of Corbin's arguments is, and you see that what he's doing here, he's arguing that the Cartesian cultural grammar that basically, replicates the axial two worlds, but within us. So here's the world of mind, the abstract intelligible world, pure mind, and the concrete sensible world is the world of pure matter. That's the Cartesian division. And what Corbin is arguing is, yeah, but we've lost the imaginal that bridges between those two worlds, between the mind and the material. Now, of course, Descartes splits things in another way. And the and the imaginal mediates between those. And these, of course, they're not the same. That's why I represent them with two different axes, but they're not independent. That's why I'm putting them together within the schema. The imaginal also bridges between the purely subjective and the purely objective. So to use the term I've been trying to develop with you, and we saw it through Heidegger, the imaginal is deeply transjective in nature. So it mediates and it's transjective. And then what you have to do is you have to see this whole thing sort of in motion, which I can't draw for you. Because the imaginal isn't a static relation, it's also a constant transformative transframing. It's a constant transformative transframing. There's a movement to the imaginal. It's vibrant and vital in that way. There's movement to it. So this is what Corbin means by the imaginal. It's a use of images but not using them subjectively, using them transjectively. We'll try to come back to that. In a way that mediates, bridges, integrates the abstract intelligible world and the concrete sensible worlds together. But again, not just statically, but in this ongoing transformative transframing. So because of the centrality of the imaginal to Corbin, and he explicitly understood himself as doing this, and he stated this, right? He was deeply opposed to fundamentalism. And here you can, of course, see the connection to Persian history I was relating to you. He's deeply opposed to fundamentalism and literalism. Why? Because fundamentalism and literalism, right? First of all, they ratify this. They make it static. And they put things into either the abstract intelligible world or the concrete sensible world, or just into subjectivity, or just into objectivity. They freeze this and then they fracture it, and thereby they completely lose the nexus of the imaginal. And for Corbin, if you lose the imaginal, you lose the capacity for gnosis. And then if you lose the capacity for gnosis, you lose the capacity for waking up within the being mode through aletheia to being and the ground of being in sacredness. And for Corbin, if you lose the imaginal, you lose the capacity for gnosis. And if you lose the capacity for gnosis, you lose the capacity for waking up within the being mode through aletheia to being and the ground of being in sacredness. This is going to be something we're going to keep seeing. And again, something that Heidegger doesn't make explicit, but it's explicated in Corbin, the deep ongoing criticism to fundamentalism and literalism. It's a deep component of Jung as well. Jung sees fundamentalism and literalism as the antithetical movement of thought and being in the world to everything he's trying to promote as a response to the meaning crisis. It's also deeply antagonistic to what Barfield was talking about when he's talking about poetic participation. So we're seeing again a potential way in which we can understand Heidegger's critique of ontotheology, because there's a tendency, and all these thinkers keep pointing to it, if we get into the having mode and we get into ontotheology and we have a supreme being and we have the supreme being and we have our propositions about this ultimate being, that we can think that the way in which we should be is to have those propositions in a fundamentalist, literalist fashion. We're going to lose all of this. And what you'll hear is you'll hear the invocation of the symbolic as a dismissive term. Yeah, so that, but yes, you can read this symbolically, but it's just symbolic, meaning it has no relevance or importance, has no real relevance or importance for you. Corbin is trying to argue exactly the opposite. If you have an attitude toward the symbolic as that is dismissive, then of course you've lost the capacity for gnosis, which means you've lost the capacity to remember forget, like to overcome in aletheia the forgetfulness of being, to come out of the deepest kind of modal confusion. Okay, I just had to move outside because I'm trying to be sensitive to the context around me. Okay, where were we with John? If you have an attitude toward the symbolic that is dismissive, then of course you've lost the capacity for gnosis, which means you've lost the capacity to remember like to overcome in aletheia the forgetfulness of being, to come out of the deepest kind of modal confusion, or in passing, to pause, what I would call the split condition, the dual condition, the fall, to come out of the fall. Anyway, to continue, I see somebody as exemplifying this, although I don't think he's directly influenced by Corbin. I see Jonathan Pageau is trying to bring us back to this gnosis of the symbol. and how we should not be dismissive of it. We should not try and slide it into either a conceptual world or essential world. And we should not interpret it as merely subjective or reject it because we can't make it clearly objective for us. Look at all the ejecting going on, subject, reject. Okay, so now to try and bring out the imaginal in a way that connects with Dasein, your being in the world. Because remember, your self-knowledge and your participatory knowing of being, your self-knowledge and your participatory knowing of being are interpenetrating and knowing together. I have to bring out something of Corbin that if you read it and you haven't done all of this work, I guarantee you will misread it and misunderstand it. And it's a part that's difficult for me, John, because it pushes my buttons in a way that I don't like, which is why I keep reading this stuff. Because I have a tremendous sense that it's pushing my buttons in a way that they need to be pushed so that I could perhaps wear free from them, at least to some degree. So Corbin's understanding of the symbol. And here's where Corbin is different from Heidegger, where he really does pick up on the sense of sacredness that's going on within the imaginal. Okay, so let's talk about how Corbin understands the symbol, the imaginal understanding of the symbol, as opposed to the imaginary understanding, the dismissive understanding of the symbol. Okay, so what are these features? The feature that was brought out when Chris and I, John, had that excellent discussion, the translucency of a symbol. You look at it, but you look through it in both meanings of the word. By means of it and beyond it, like the way I'm looking through my glasses. The symbol is translucent. I can look at it, but I can also simultaneously look through it. Gosh. And I can put these two into an important dialogue. And I can put these two into an important dialogue. Why do I want a dialogue between looking at it and looking through it? Why is it so important to have those in dialogue with each other? Because that is how the symbol can help you to capture the non-logical identity between your agent arena now in this frame and the agent arena in a more comprehensive, encompassing frame. Why do I want a dialogue between looking at it and looking through it? Why is it so important to have those in dialogue with each other? Because that is how the symbol can help you. That's how the symbol can help you to capture the non-logical identity between your agent arena now in this frame and the agent arena in a more comprehensive, encompassing frame. So symbols are translucent. As I've already argued, they're transjective. Trying to make them either subjective or objective is aligned with a having mode dismissal of how the symbol is trying to challenge you to transcendence. If you're not transcending in response to a symbol, you haven't really understood a symbol. Look, if you're not transcending in response to a symbol, then you haven't really understood the symbol. You haven't really remembered through the symbol. It's been no aletheia. In your pursuit of the correctness of truth, you've forgotten the aletheia of the symbol. That's why I'm so critical of people who are so dismissive of symbolism. The symbol is not only transjective, it's trajective. It's not only transjective between subject and object, it's also trajective. It's putting you on a trajectory of transforming. Sorry, it's putting you on a trajectory of transformation, as I was just articulating. The symbol is transformative. Remember the transformation, remember the transformative, sorry. Remember the transformation of the inner man. It's transforming you at a fundamental level. And the symbol is ultimately transtemporal, transspatial. Transtemporal and transspatial, because it has to do with this movement between worlds. It has to do with this movement between worlds, which really isn't a narrative, temporal, spatial movement. It's an ontological movement. It's an ontological movement between, a smaller frame and a larger frame. I represent it with an arrow, but it isn't movement through time and space. It isn't movement through time and space. It isn't a narrative change. It isn't a narrative change. It's an ontological shift. So I'm trying to pick up all of these. So I'm trying to pick all of these up. The translucency of the symbol, it's transjective, it's trajective, it's transformative, and it's transtemporal, transspatial aletheia through the symbol. That's how you do gnosis. Now let's give the troubling example that is so central to Corbin. And I found it disturbing in ways, and some of you will too, and I hope so. What I ask for right now is be patient because I want to unpack this. What I ask for right now is be patient because I want to unpack this. I don't want to try and be dismissive, but I want to show you that Corbin is not using this notion in a way you standardly will. And like I said, I hesitate to do so. The most important symbol for this, the most important symbol of this for Corbin is what he calls the angel. And that's why Chatham puts it in the title of his book, and Avens puts it in the subtitle of his book on the new gnosis, Heidegger, Hillman, and angels. As soon as I put up there, many of you are now rolling your eyes as I did. There's a part of me that I can feel there's tension behind my eyes wanting to roll them. Oh no, angels. Oh, silly, superstitious idea, cherubs and only New Age people that, swing crystals and, the angels and all that stuff. And it's like, oh no, what a disaster. And I deeply appreciate that. I'm not being dismissive of that. I would say that that's an imaginary understanding of angels, and one that Corbin himself repeatedly and deeply rejects. So what's he talking about? Why is he using this term? Okay, he's using it because it's a term that's filled and that fills some of the literature of the Persian Sufism that he reads. And I want to propose to you an alternative way of understanding this to what our sort of cultural imaginary way of understanding this. So let me go back into our history to try and get a different way of leading into this notion and then take it into some cutting edge analytic philosophy, some current cutting edge analytic philosophy, believe it or not, and show how that fits well and comports well with the cognitive science that we've been doing throughout this response to the four prophets of the meaning crisis. Okay, so now I'm making use of the seminal work of Stang, Charles Stang. Stang wrote a book called The Divine Double, which is a follow-up to a book he wrote on pseudodionysus, and he's written some brilliant articles on pseudodionysus that brings all this out. Now, so the book is called The Divine Double, and he's pointing to a particular motif that was prevalent in the Mediterranean world and remember we talked about the Hellenistic domicide and thereafter, and you have the rise of Gnosticism and early Christianity. And so during this period, and across many different groups, you see it within Gnosticism. He makes a clear case. And again, some people are going to go, no, he makes a clear case for this motif showing up within early Christianity. You see it in Manichaeism. You see it clearly in Neoplatonism and Plotinus, this notion of the divine double. I'm spending time on this because you won't understand Jung also if you don't understand this divine double. Okay. So what's the notion of the divine double? It becomes prevalent through the Mediterranean spirituality of the Hellenistic and post-Hellenistic period. And I didn't talk about it that much when I talked about the Gnostics and the Neoplatonists because I wanted to talk about it here because here is where I think it belongs. Because here is where I think it belongs. This was the idea. And again, part of this is how this is so antithetical to our way of thinking, especially our decadent romantic way of thinking. So the decadent romantic way of thinking, that sort of goes back to Rousseau, is that you're born with your true self, and you have to be true to your true self, and you have to express it. Express it. And that's what it is to be authentic. So this has become pervasive in our culture, right? In this Mediterranean spirituality, this motif is very different. Is this idea that I'm here and I have a self right now. Or they might say, I'm not going to try and pronounce that, a spirit or a soul. I have myself right now, but it's bound. It's bound to the divine double. There's a double of me. There's a double of me that is archetypically more important than me. And that what I'm doing, my true self, is actually this divine double. And my spiritual path is to reunite this self with that divine double. And to bring the two together, then that realization of their interdependence culminates in a kind of mystical union between them. Again, quote, I'm bound to the divine double. There's a double of me that's archetypically more important than me. And that what I'm doing, my true self, is actually this divine double. And my spiritual path is to reunite this self with that divine double. And to bring the two together. And that realization of their interdependence culminates in a kind of mystical union between them. Now, this is still all very fuzzy language. I'll grant you that. But first of all, notice how this is very interesting. Step aside from the mythos for a minute and think about the concept. So you see how this is Gnostic, right? Not in the sense of Gnosticism. Well, maybe a little bit in the sense of Gnosticism because this is transgressive. It's trying to break the grammar. It's trying to break the grammar of thinking of your true self as something that you have. Your identity is something that you have, that you're born with it. It's in you. And what you have to do is express it authentically. That grammar is being subverted and transgressed by the idea that your true self is beyond you and you have to aspire to it. Your true self is beyond you and you have to aspire to it. And you see there's a bit of a Socratic element there, right? That your true self is something you aspire to rather than something you have. The true self is something realized through the being mode of self-transcendence, not through the having mode of inner possession. And so the divine double, it is pervasive. It's a pervasive mythos. And first of all, what I recommend is, and I think this is a very fair recommendation, that you understand Corbin's use of the angel as a symbolic way of talking about the divine double. And you may say, okay, that's great. And I see why it challenges the grammar, but I don't care about this because, all right, I didn't believe in angels and I don't believe in divine doubles. So telling me about angels in terms of divine doubles, what does that gain me? It gains me nothing. Now moving into a section called an aspirational process towards a more angelic self. Quote, well, I want you to be very careful here. I want to be very careful here. I want to start a problem. I want to start you on a deep analysis of this, right? And let's focus in on this very process of aspiration towards a better self, towards a more angelic self, right? Because it goes back to the Socratic project. But you can also see it in the depths of our current. Sorry, no, that's too broad. So you can see, this process of aspiration towards a greater, better, fuller self. That's all the way through Maslow. It's all the way through Jung. This aspirational process is central to a lot of the mythos that we've been talking about, how we're going to normatively improve not our situation, but ourself. I'm going to pause for a second just to say that normatively improved normative order is connected with presence, connected with a perspectival layer of knowing. We're clearly talking about this layer of identity, which is beneath the narrative order layer, right? And then I think also if we're really getting at gnosis, which is a transjective co-transformation of self and world, then I think to me, we can see that, like, to me, this is obviously clearly connected with the transformation of our identity that goes along with the cultural enlightenment that is part of a rational response to the metacrisis, meaning crisis combination, and that can actually improve our situation. Or at least I'm curious about that. I'm curious about how it could improve our situation. Okay, to continue. So is the divine double a crazy idea? Well, in one sense it is. Again, if you just sort of literalize the mythos into some sort of literalize the mythos into some sort of axial two-world mythology and metaphysics, sure. But maybe it's not a crazy idea if we go back and try to ask this question. Instead of asking the question, look, this is what I meant about real dialogue. Real dialogue, philia sophia, not philia nikia. Love of wisdom, not the love of victory. Instead of asking the question, should I believe that? Instead of asking the question, should I believe that? First, ask yourself the question, why did so many different groups of people in the world believe that? What was going on there? What was it doing? And here is where I think I can immediately invoke the important work which I've discussed repeatedly throughout the entire argument in this series, the important work of L.A. Paul and transformative experience. And that was bound up with the way we talk about gnosis. Now, I alluded to somebody else's work. That was influenced and from the same area, sort of, I don't know what to call it, school as L.A. Paul's work. And this is a really important work of Agnes Callard in her book entitled Aspiration. And she's arguing for a neglected form of rationality that's best understood through aspiration. And rationality, remember, I don't use rationality to mean management of just the logical management of argumentation. Rationality means any systematically reliable internalized psychotechnology. Rationality means any systematically reliable internalized psychotechnology that reliably and systematically affords you overcoming self-deception and affords you cultivating enhanced connectedness, enhanced meaning in life. That's why the notion of rationality I've argued for, is bound up with it can culminate, it could point toward the cultivation of wisdom. So let's talk about yourself before the transformation or before you launch into the aspirational process and the self afterwards. So S1 and S2, which has nothing to do with different kinds of cognition, S1 and S2. And so L.A. Paul tends to represent this as a much more rapid, much more sort of rapid transition. And I think there's important truth in that, the insight. Whereas Agnes Callard is representing it much more, not incrementally, but much more developmentally, having a much more extended developmental trajectory. And you can reconcile those, I think, quite readily by seeing qualitative development as a sequence of insightful transformations. So I don't think there's any deep inconsistency here. Okay, so what's the problem here? Well, as I've already pointed out, with any genuine qualitative development, with quantitative elements, you just get sort of like more things, more beliefs, more experiences. But with qualitative development, is why I'm so different in kind from that kid that was born in Hamilton. It's a fundamental difference of competence, of what I can know, and what I can do, and what I can be, rather than just how much. And so I've already pointed out that you have an issue here of non-logical identity. Okay, so this is not an identity relation that can be captured by the fundamental identity theorem in logic that A is identical to A, meaning that they share all the same properties. We do not. So John in Hamilton and John in Toronto. John in Hamilton then and John in Toronto now, we're not this. They're not the same. A does not equal A. So we have a non-logical identity. And I've brought that out. And how much gnosis is about the difficulties of trying to overcome the difficulties that this poses because of this non-logical identity. I'm not going to repeat those arguments. Go back and look at them when I talked about gnosis. I think it's episode 18. We cannot reason our way through this. We cannot reason our way through this. We cannot infer our way through this. The Metacrisis. We cannot reason our way through this. We cannot infer our way through this. And Callard is deeply in agreement with this aspect. You cannot deliberate your way through it. You cannot decide your way through it. So what is the nature of the relation, right? Well, Callard thinks it's aspirational. It involves what she calls aspiration, but she's at pains to point something out that L.A. Paul doesn't, which I think is very important. You can't, if you don't include this process as part of what you mean by this term, you're going to get into a deeply self-refuting position because my relationship to rationality and my relationship to wisdom are aspirational. I'm aspiring to become rational precisely because I'm not currently that rational. And if the aspiration to rationality is not a part of rationality, you're getting into a weird kind of self-refutation. The aspiration of rationality is constitutive of the ongoing process of being rational. And therefore, it must be included in your notion of rationality. And notice how we're getting back toward the Platonic idea of deep interpenetration of love and reason. Took a long time, eh? Took a long time to circle back around to that. Of course, this is also the case for wisdom. So also, look, think about it this way. One of the things I need to do to become rational is to become more educated. But Callard explicitly argues a genuine education, well, there's two different meanings to that word now. One is just the accumulation of facts and skills and stuff like that. But for many, and this is what it was supposed to be, maybe still is, this is a defining feature of the liberal education. Liberal, to liberate you. So to gnosis, to save you. German written, to save one into oneself. To liberate you from existential entrapment. Our liberal education is designed to make you into a better self, a better person, which is why it seems so useless to people who want to manipulate and control you. Think about that when you side with, oh, liberal education. So you're getting on the wrong side because we're losing something there, right? So a liberal education, and this is what it meant. This is what it classically meant when you go back into the Middle Ages, is gnosis, is aspirational. And you don't know what it's going to be like. Remember all that stuff about L.A. Paul, as in you don't know what's on the other side of a transformative experience because it's one way. Quote. So let me leave you with the example from Callard, and then we'll come back and talk about this in the next episode and expand this whole, what is that? What am I trying? What am I leading you toward? And I'm leading you toward this, indicates S1 and S2. The relationship between the existing self and the divine double. The relationship between the existing self and the divine double. Or another way of perhaps putting it, the divine double is a symbol, in Corbin's sense, that allows you to move from yourself now to yourself then to the better self. One of the examples that Callard gives in Aspiration, the book, is, and think about how this fits in with a liberal arts education, somebody who wants to come to appreciate music and notice a play on how that word appreciation means both understand and gratitude. It has a connotative emotional aspect, and it has a denotative conceptual aspect, cognitive aspect, I should say. I will understand music. So I want it, let's say I don't currently get classical music, but I have an inkling that's really important, that it's really important. I think that, Charles Williams, Barfield, and Tolkien and C.S. Lewis call themselves the inklings. So I have an inkling that there's a self and a world there. Remember, we talked about the person trapped in this world, but a sense that there might be a better self and a better world over there. And I have an inkling that I should like classical music, but I don't currently like classical music. I have to come to be the kind of being that appreciates classical music. Well, how do I do that? How do I bridge from me now not appreciating, not getting, not liking, not enjoying classical music to somebody who can sincerely say, I love classical music. I really get it now. How can I? We use this phrase and notice how it's so rich and resonant, with contact epistemology, but now I have a taste. for music. I have an acquired taste for it. Let's get behind the metaphor. How is it? I notice when you taste something, you're putting it into your being. It's not only contact, it's even consumption, not in a having mode sense, but taking it in, taking it deeply in, right? What is it to move that way? What I'm trying to show you is that Corbin's talk about the angel is a way of him invoking and bringing into activity all of this stuff about symbolism that we've talked about and integrate it with this process of aspirational rationality that is so central to self-transcendence and so central to us becoming more rational and more wise. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Okay, I'm just noticing that I don't have very much battery on my laptop, so what I'm going to do is, yeah, appreciate you for listening to that. I didn't have many insights come through in the second half, but I think presencing all that there feels still important to me, and so I'm going to simply let it be what it is. And then basically what I'm going to do is connect all of John's many insights from these remarkable people. Like, thank you so much, John. That was amazing, right? To this and to the rest of the prescription that we've been talking about as a way to start to understand or like to presence all of this a little bit more directly when we go through the new gnosis. Um, and not to mention the rest of my experience of being alive and being Sam right now. Um, yeah, I'm going to come back and do episode 49 because it's also deadly relevant, it feels to me. So, yeah, thanks for coming along.